That's great, Margaret. Nice to see you again. So look, it's just gone after 1 o'clock, and I think we've got quite a lot of content to cover. So I'm going to start off, and anybody struggling to join, they'll message us directly. So welcome to January session of this community looking at artificial intelligence in health and care, health and social care, and we'll go through why this community was set up, and we'll look forward to having some of the comments around your thoughts about artificial intelligence. But I thought it would be really helpful, because we don't want this to be a broadcast to session. We want to be able to include people in the conversation. We want to be able to make use of the chat box that's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So there's different ways of communicating. You can message me directly and say that you've got something that you want to say, and I'll be able to unmute you. But if you are chatting in the box, it's also helpful just to have some norms around that, because what tends to happen is people end up talking over each other and trying to figure out who's talking to who. So say, for example, that I've made a comment about the sound, for example, you can do the @ symbol and my name, and that will know that you're connecting directly with me, and just helps us better conversations that are going on throughout the day. I'd like to also introduce my co-conspirator and co-facilitator, John, who is with us today. John, do you want to say hello, John?
Yeah, thanks, Dom. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. Very excited that this community is sort of galvanizing around really important topical questions. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And John will also be helping steer some of the conversations in the chat box as well. So feel free to message him directly. We've also got the presenters that will be with us. Dr. Natalie Banner will be joining us first to start a conversation around data, and also at about 1:30, we're going to have Dr. William Bradlow, who will be joining us. He's in the moment in a clinic, and will be joining us straight away after that. As soon as he finishes, he's going to run across Birmingham University Hospitals to join us, and I look forward to the conversation that he'll be leading. We'll also be using the hashtag AI community, so if there's anything else that you're picking up or you want to share wider than this internal session, feel free to share that out wide and far. I think this is really about working out loud and sharing some of the learnings as we go through this together. To start off with, just to kind of build the anticipation of us connecting with each other, I'd really like to make use of some of the tools that we've got in WebEx, and one of them is just, I'm going to assign some privileges now so that you can annotate over this. So over on the top left-hand corner, there should be an arrow in the WebEx. What we'd like you to do is just indicate where you are from in England and across the UK, and if you're international, then feel free to say that you're coming from abroad, just so we have a clear indication about where people are coming from all over the country. So, as always, quite a good spread. Pardeep's making it clear that he's from Coventry. Apologies, that's my emails. Brilliant. Birmingham, great. There seems to be quite a few in the West Midlands as well, and as far as Newcastle upon Tyne. So those of you who are struggling to do that, it's over on the left-hand corner if you're using your desktop. There's a little arrow symbol. If you click on that, and you'll be able to put it on. We'll have another go at this on the next screen. So thank you everybody for sharing on that. Just to go through the agenda for now, I'm just going to cover about why we're here and why this community was set up. Dr. Natalie Banner is going to talk about public confidence in the use of patient data. And as mentioned, Dr. William Bradlow will come on just after 1:30, talking about making data work for hearts at risk and some of the work he's doing there. And then we want to open it up to you guys to see if there's anything else that you want to cover and discuss at this session or for more bespoke ones. Opening up your annotation tools again, just to get an indication as to, there's quite a few new people who have joined us on this session, to understand where you think you are confident in terms of understanding what AI is. At the start, are you a keen explorer? Do you understand about machine learning? Are you an expert? Are you practicing this? quite interesting to see how humble some people are who I know that are a bit, yes, definitely a bit further down down that scale. Right, so lots to learn, and lots to learn from you, Alex, by the looks of it as well. So looking forward to your comments through this or anything else that you feel might be relevant for this community to hear. The next one, I just want to understand the people that are on this live session, what sectors you're coming from. Do you represent an NHS organisation? Are you coming from social care? Do you work for a charity? Are you doing some research? Are you a vendor, etc.? Brilliant. Hi, Tina. Okay, so another good spread then. I think we need some more charity representation, and definitely something that I know I've been speaking to Lynn about is the social care, because social care have been doing quite a lot of interesting work around this, so bringing them into the conversation and learning from that sector as well. Something just to think about, you can either comment on this directly, is that, you know, what we don't want to do is just be pushing loads of information. We'd really like you guys who are learning and exploring and some of the stuff that you come across to share that back into the community. So, you know, what kind of things can you offer? What kind of work are you currently doing? Do you have, is there pieces that you would like to talk about? If you can give an indication on the screen or just in the chat functionality, that's really helpful. Just give us some time for some more people to join us. This is great. So for those of you who have expressed that, it'd be really, really helpful if you could connect with us either during the session or directly on email about some of those offers, so that we can share that out to the wider community around the work that you're currently doing or the things that you find interesting. So thank you for that, and it's nice to see that people are willing to share. Now, one of the things that the work that I do in the Horizons team is looking at how we can create grassroots social movement change and make sure that, you know, everybody's encouraged and embedded into the conversation. And one of the critical things that's coming out in our research is that, you know, if we, this is Chip Bell's comment around, if we take care on the relationships that we build, that results will follow. And I think that's really clear, just even in the short few months that we've established this community. It's really nice to see that people are connecting with each other and sharing and, you know, giving people opportunity to work on different projects or speaking engagements. So that's really welcome. And in that case, I would like to the use of the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner, just to introduce yourself, where you're from, if you're able to, and why you're here, what makes this interesting to you. So you can comment directly on the screen, but it'd be really good if you can connect into the chat box so that we can see who's here, what organizations you represent, and maybe there's other people that want to follow up with you after this session. Now, I'm not going to go into too much other detail because I would like to hand over to Natalie in a second, but some of the other research that we find is that if you want to influence the system, I think, you know, a lot of us that are joining these conversations around really interesting technology adoption, we want to find those 3% within the system who typically drive the conversations with the 85% of other people. And I really feel that some of the people that are joining our conversations really do enable that conversation, our connectors across the system, to help accelerate and speed up the conversation on what we need to do to get the technology that we all want used within our precious health system. And what we also find is that as many reports that we can produce, and there's nothing wrong with report writing or documentation, because it's very helpful in putting a stake in the ground. I think one of the key things that we're finding is that, and this is Nick Milton's research, that the conversations and discussions are 14 times more effective than any best practice databases or toolkits that we produce. And that comes from even some of the improvement work that happens within the NHS. So with that in mind, I'm going to shortly hand over to Natalie, if you can get yourself ready, Natalie. But one of the things that's been coming out over the last couple of months with regards to some of the health people who are engaged in this, they would like to see some of the art of the possible that's happening with artificial intelligence and its broad landscape. And with that in mind, this community was set up for the health sector to have this conversation and not necessarily be led by vendors. What I'm really interested in doing is see if we can come together and form a terms of reference so that we can engage some of the vendors that are doing some really interesting work and have been doing some really interesting research in the background, and how we can do it in a way that's fair and equitable for everybody else. So I would love to have this as a separate conversation, maybe in a couple of weeks' time with you. So please connect with myself and John, and we can figure out how we galvanize a conversation around this so that we can invite people who are doing some of the interesting work within their companies to share what's happening there. I'm just now going to hand over to Natalie Banner, who's a policy advisor at the Wellcome Trust and Understanding Patient Data, who's now going to talk about public confidence in patient data. I'm really excited about this session because this really ties into some of the previous conversations we've been having, and also I know directly some of us who have been really interested about the research that Natalie's been doing. So Natalie, can I hand over to you if you're there?
Can everyone hear me? See me?
I can see you loud.
Right.
See you, hear you loud and clear. So I'll leave you to it.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Dominic, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's really great to sort of connect with this growing grassroots community. It's a very exciting time. I'll just start off by saying why public confidence, why sort of are we concerned about these sorts of issues in the use of patient data. I think there's a lot of excitement, a huge amount of hype at the moment about AI and its potential, particularly in healthcare. It seems to be one of the areas where, you know, a lot of people think there's huge amounts of potential opportunity. But of course, AI is underpinned by huge amounts of data, right? So there needs to be data available, accessible, usable by lots of different people if we're going to be able to make the best use of AI type tools. And of course, there are lots of difficulties with accessing data. Many people trying to get hold of data sets have experienced huge numbers of difficulties, whether that's from NHS Digital or from, you know, NHS trusts. Trying to collect and use data is really difficult. There's problems around the governance of data, infrastructure, you know, collections of large data sets and so on. A lot of those issues are big kind of policy challenges and questions. But there's one issue that we actually can all collectively do something about, and that's public confidence in the use of data. And this is one of the sort of fundamental parts of the problem about access to data, is if people, if patients and the public aren't confident that data is being used well and being used properly and kind of, you know, happy with the use of data, then we're not going to be able to access it and use it for anything. And I think the care.data debacle is just sort of one example of how horribly things can go wrong if there isn't that sort of public confidence and trust in what actually happens to data in practice and how it's used. So that's why I'm focusing on public confidence. Let me just see if I can advance these slides. Now, most people have never really thought about patient data. It's not something that kind of crops up in their day-to-day lives. But if they have thought about it, it's likely they've thought about it because they've read headlines like this. This is a sort of classic, slightly sensationally scare stories that are quite prominent in the media. You have this kind of storm of concern about what's happening to data, companies accessing it, it being used for nefarious purposes, it not being quite clear who's getting hold of data, whether it's being bought and sold in the NHS, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of the most engagement the majority of people have with the idea of patient data potentially being used for purposes other than their own care. And so we're starting off from a challenging point, which is that this is the kind of only exposure people have had to the use of patient data. And a couple of years ago, we did a piece of research with Ipsos Mori, and I think I might have seen Harry Evans was on the list. So Harry is very expert in this as well. He undertook this research when he was at Ipsos. We did a piece of research looking at the public attitudes towards commercial access to data, because we know this is one of the things that people are most concerned about. And this here is sort of one of the most insightful quotes. It's actually what we named the report after, the one-way mirror. This sense of people feeling that there's as a sort of they on the other side of this mirror. You know, they have access to all this information about you. They know things about you. You have no idea who they are or what they are doing with data. So this real sort of caution, concern, suspicion, and obviously lack of trust that people tended to have because they didn't understand what was happening to data, why it was being used, and so on. So we did some social research looking at how people feel about different kinds of uses of data, and one of the interesting things we found was that if you give people a little bit of information, if you tell them something about the fact that their data is being used, say, for research purposes, they get very, very concerned very quickly. And you can see that sort of illustrative graph there. The level of concern shoots up if you tell people a little bit. But what we did find was the more you tend to tell people, the more comfortable they feel. So if you can answer questions around, well, what are the rules around accessing the data? You know, who's actually using it? Why are they using it? What do they need to use it for? If you can answer those sorts of questions, you tend to find that people become more supportive, less concerned. Now, I think the problem with care.data was it precisely hit that peak of concern with a little bit of information about the fact that data was being used, but there were not adequate sort of answers to those kind of fairly straightforward questions, and so people's level of concern was just really high, and I think that's what happened there. But we found in our research, and if you have a look at this quote, I think it sort of summarises the picture quite nicely. I knew nothing about this until today. At first I was concerned, but now I'm more reassured. So not only sort of feeling more comfortable, but also it's important that data is used in this way by the NHS. So you actually take someone from a position of knowing very little, getting very concerned, and then going, oh, actually, this is really important. We need to be doing more of this. And so that's sort of that general curve that we found. Not everyone sort of follows this. There is a minority of people who object to the idea of data being used under any circumstances. But you'll generally tend to find that providing more of that information is actually really beneficial to people. But where are the concerns? This is another thing that we sort of unpacked during this research. Well, first and foremost, you have to be really clear about why you're using the data. If you can articulate that, you're off to a good start, right? So why is the data being used? If there is a public benefit, generally you'll find that people are supportive, and particularly more willing to accept commercial involvement if there is that public benefit there. People are also more supportive if you say, look, this research won't be able to be done unless we involve private partners. And then, you can have that conversation about why that's necessary, why the taxpayer can't necessarily sort of fund all this research. So if you can get clear on the why, and you can answer the who, and it's clear that what the data is being used for has this public benefit, then, that's a very good start. People do have concerns about what kind of data you're using. Is it, your full record, or, is it fully identifiable data, and so on. So you need to be able to articulate what sort of data you're using. And generally, people assume that things like storage and data security, they're sort of hygiene factors. People kind of assume that these things are in place. So you need to be able to answer those questions about why, who, what, and how, if you're going to help people sort of generate sort of confidence and trust in what you're doing with data. Generally speaking, when thinking about commercial interests in using data, people's concerns tend to be around either risks to themselves, so they worry about what might happen to themselves or their families if companies access this data. And then they also have more, philosophical objections to the idea of commercial involvement in the NHS. There's sort of more abstract concerns about the idea of commercial involvement. Very much the main objections that we found were people being concerned about access to data for insurance purposes and for marketing. Those were two red lines where no matter how much you said, look, there could be a benefit coming from this, they said, no, we do not want data to be used for those purposes. So with that in mind, where we took this research was to develop some more thinking around, well, what do people want to know? What kind of questions do they have? And if you're someone who's wanting to use data for a research purpose or to build a product or to deliver something to the health service, what are the kind of questions you need to be able to answer up front? And the slide I've got here are just some of the typical things that people want to know at the outset about what happens to data and how it could be used. And we're in the process of developing some tools and resources that can help you to be able to answer some of these. I'm just going to talk very quickly through a couple of the resources that we've developed, and then I'll come on to specifically thinking about AI and sort of data-driven technologies as well. So, as I said before, one of the key things that people want to know is why. Why are you using data for these purposes? Yes, research sounds good. Of course we should do research, but why do you need data from my records, to be able to undertake this sort of research? Well, we've developed this kind of wheel, as it were, that shows 7 different categories of purposes of using data. And we've done this because we think it's important both to be able to articulate sort of quite specifically what the purpose of the data use is, but also because a wheel like this shows just how valuable data use can be. You've got all of these different ways in which the data could be used, and individual care and providing that care is just one of those uses. So this is just a sort of starting point for having a conversation, saying that this is all the different ways that data can be useful, and it provides a bit of a platform for then having a further conversation about, say, specific research uses and so on. I've just seen a note that says someone can't see the slides. Dominic, I'm very, very happy for these to be circulated after the event.
Thanks, Nadia. That's very helpful.
Another question that people often have is about, well, can I be identified from the data? So even if people are supportive of being able to use data for medical research, there are concerns about whether I'm identified from it. I think people have this sort of perception of if your data is shared, then you've got this whole big, manila file that goes to someone or disappears into a company and you don't know what happens to it. And whether or not someone's identifiable is obviously a big concern. The challenge here is that identifiability and whether data is identifiable or whether it's personal or not is really complex. It's really hard to be able to articulate whether a particular data source counts as personal data or not. And this is also complicated by obviously the General Data Protection Regulation coming in. It's a technical, complex, difficult subject. And it doesn't sound great if you can say, well, it's sort of, it could be personal if you added this information to it or you undid this encryption, and you don't have that capacity, particularly talking to someone for the first time, to go into a lot of technical detail about what k-anonymity is, for example. So we developed this resource that provides, a baseline for conversations about whether data that's being used for research is identifiable or not. And we found the pictures work really, really nicely. And particularly this image I've got here, the one in the middle, the kind of pixelated, the blurred image of the person, is a really helpful one we found in the research that we've been doing, because it gets across the idea that data is still about an individual, but you can't necessarily tell who that person is. You can increase or decrease the blurriness of the picture to make it sort of seem more or less likely to be able to be identified. But the key thing to get across is that in principle, if you had enough other information, you may well be able to re-identify this person. And that's an important point to get across, so you don't give the impression that everything is, 100% guaranteed, no way that you could be identified from this, because the fact is, if data is in the public domain, for example, or you have enough additional information, under some circumstances, you may be able to re-identify people. And generally, it seems better to have that slightly more sophisticated view than just saying, don't worry, guys, it's safe, everything's fine, trust us, because that really is a recipe for a hack, a mistake, a disaster that then leads to someone being re-identified, leads to some harms, and then you've sort of lost any basis of people having trust in what it is you're trying to do. So we found these kind of resources to be really helpful for starting off those conversations. So that's just generally about sort of confidence in patient data use broadly. But what is it that people think about AI and the use of data specifically in AI? It's fair to say there's been limited research so far. This is obviously an area that seems to be exploding in interest at the moment, and lots of interest, particularly in the ethics of AI and data use, and interest in privacy and what the impacts of AI are going to be for people and for their sort of control and use of data. We're in the process of undertaking research with the Academy of Medical Sciences. We're doing a public dialogue project with them, talking to clinicians, patients, and the general public about the use of data-driven technologies in healthcare and research. And those we're doing some groups that are kicking off in the next few weeks. Hopefully the results of that public dialogue will be out in late spring. So that's one piece of research that hopefully should help shed some light on how people feel about the idea of using AI, using data in AI tools and so on for healthcare. But aside from that, the general sort of public perception of AI, I think, is largely driven by Terminator, HAL, we've got Marvin, the paranoid android there as well, and these sorts of headlines. This is the kind, I mean, I just drew these from publications in the last 2 weeks. Again, sort of media and film-driven concerns about AI, and even just in the headlines there, you can see everything from worries about employment to security to the ability of AI to be kind of creepy in the sense of what it can predict and what it can tell about you, to the Elon Musk school of this is going to doom human civilization. So it's fair to say that media portrayals thus far have been pretty terrifying, actually. There are lots of excitement about the potential for AI, but for the general public who haven't necessarily been exposed to some of those more sort of technical conversations, this is the sort of picture that they might well have about AI. So how do we then sort of reel it back from that and say, okay, well, hang on a minute, taking it away from Terminator, what can we actually do in practice? How can we talk about AI? How can we explore what people's views are, how they feel, and what they actually think might be beneficial in terms of artificial intelligence? And in doing some scoping for research that we're doing, we looked at different kind of purposes of using AI and other sorts of data-driven technologies. And I think it's helpful to bring it back to the purpose rather than focusing on the technology. There's not a lot of areas of technology advancement where we look at the underpinning technology. We're looking at how it's being used, what's the purpose, why are we using this? And actually there's a whole network of technologies that may well be used, cloud computing alongside AI, for example. But the thing that we're really interested in, and the thing that patients and the public are going to want to engage with most is the why. It's coming back to that question of why are you using this? Why are you using this data? And so the purpose is really important. And again, if we can articulate some really clear, straightforward purposes for using these technologies, then I think we stand a better chance of having that sort of conversation that's not entirely overshadowed by visions of Terminator and sort of dooming civilization and so on. So taking the discussion away from that hype and focusing on the purpose about what the technology is doing and why, I think is a really, really good point. I just want to wrap up with a couple of challenges. I'm not sure, the slide hasn't quite worked out very well, but a couple of challenges in thinking about AI and other data-driven technologies. Firstly, we have a question about language. Now, AI and talking about data can come across, as I mentioned before, as kind of quite dry, quite technical, quite complex. In other words, quite boring for a lot of people. On the other hand, it can also come across as being really creepy and scary and intimidating and weird, right? So you've got this sort of big brother kind of concerns. And trying to get a balance somewhere, because actually, to be honest, AI is probably neither of those things. It may well be somewhere in the middle. But we have to be incredibly conscious about the language we're using to talk about this. The language of disruption and so on, and hacking and things like that will not come across well to patients and the public, even though that's kind of the bread and butter of say, technology companies. Similarly, thinking about outcomes, it's been really interesting as I've sort of got stuck into this whole realm to notice the real clash of cultures between the sort of Silicon Valley tech mentality, which is, you've got to attract venture capital investment, so you've got to talk about how you're going to change the world and how fantastic your product is going to be to really revolutionize things and disrupt models of care, for example. But actually, that's not necessarily something that patients and the public will like the sound of. And actually, in reality, what you may well be doing is far more about some of the back office functions, kind of admin, routine admin, and then kind of improving those functions, which might not sound quite as exciting and sexy, but actually it may well be more realistic, and it also might help avoid some of that kind of scary hype there is around the potential for AI. Again, for thinking about how patients and the public are going to react to the idea of using these kind of snazzy new technologies to deliver healthcare and research. A couple of other things just to note is there's lots of conversations now about ownership and control of data, and the sort of perception people have, well, it's my data, so surely I should have control over what happens to it. And again, when you've got technologies that need vast amounts of data in the first place, we'll need to think very, very carefully about those questions around ownership, control, what control patients may have over their own data, what rights and so on that they could have if their data is being fed into machine learning algorithms, for example. Another point is about transparency and auditability. It's very hard to trust something, the decision of something or the output of something, if you're not sure how it's been made. And I think there has been some research that sort of indicated that even where you've got fantastic algorithms that kind of closely match with, say, a clinician diagnosis of something, a lot of clinicians won't trust that because they don't understand how that decision has been reached. And so you've got this kind of real challenge with the sort of the black box algorithm of if it's not transparent, because it fundamentally can't be, how do you enable those sorts of algorithms to be auditable, to be checked, and therefore to gain the trust of clinicians and also patients? That's a really, really big question. And finally, although this extends a little bit just beyond the data question specifically, the impact on patients and the clinician-patient relationship. You know, what's going to be the effect of trying to introduce new, say, clinical tools that rely on AI and rely on sort of having access to huge amounts of data into the sort of clinician-patient relationship? I think there are some very, very big questions there. And if we can think about those early on in designing AI tools and so on, you stand a much better chance of them actually being able to be taken up in practice and getting the support of both patients and clinicians. So I'd be very happy to continue this conversation however we like, frankly, whether you want to sort of follow up with me now or afterwards. But I want to just flag the Understanding Patient Data website, which is, it's an initiative that's launched, it's hosted by Wellcome, but it's sort of independent of it. And what we're trying to do is develop tools and resources to help with conversations about what happens to data. And the stream that I lead is particularly looking at the future, it's sort of horizon scanning, what's coming down the line in the next few years, and what can we do to try and enable and sort of provide the right resources for those conversations, so particularly thinking about AI and so on. How do we then have those conversations with patients and the public? How do we think about some of these ethical, social questions early on, rather than bolting them on to the end, going, oh, hang on a minute, how are we going to answer these fundamental questions? You know, that's really trying to build them in at an early stage. There's a very active space at the moment. There's an awful lot of thinking going on about data ethics and the use of AI, and I'm heavily involved in kind of the policy angles of that. So I'd be really happy to follow up with anyone, and very happy to take any questions. Thanks very much.
That was awesome, thank you, and very insightful. I like the way that you articulated some of those points. My definite takeaway from this was that we need to take it away from the Terminator. That's got to be the quote for 2018 in terms of the language that we're using around artificial intelligence. I want to open this up to the people that are the attendees here and ask them if they've got any questions and comments. I'm going to hand over to John in a second to kind of summarize some of the bits of conversations that were happening. But in the interim to that, and as William is joining us as well, there was a request from Matt Fennick, who's also working with the Wellcome Trust, who's doing some current research around some of the ethical issues, and is looking for people that are medical researchers, health policy experts, and computer scientists who might be interested in having a conversation in some of the research that's being galvanized around that. So I'll add that into the chat box in a second, because he'll be joining us towards possibly March or April about some of the research and findings that are happening around that space. John, can I hand over to you to see what you've galvanized from the conversation in the chat box?
Sure. Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Dom, and thank you very much, Natalie. Very insightful and useful presentation, and it's clear from the comments that people have found that very useful. I think both the resources sort of implicit in the presentation, the graphics used, as well as the sort of conceptual content are very relevant for lots of us. There are a number of threads of conversation going on. I think for now, rather than sort of summarising the threads that aren't so relevant to this last presentation, I'd like to just field a question to you, Natalie, and that, are you aware of typologies of data? For example, distinctions between data and metadata, or data that sort of is person-centered. I appreciate that you've gone through types of anonymity. Are there any other sort of typologies that you're aware of that might be useful in alleviating some of these patient and public concerns, and perhaps allowing us to be more expedient in working with data that is less sort of restricted?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I come at this very much from the, well, what's the average person going to know and engage with? And it's interesting, I think a few years ago, when the point about metadata was made, people were saying, oh, it's not data in relation to surveillance, and people were saying, oh, it's not actual data about calls that's shared, it's only metadata, and therefore it's fine. Whereas I think nowadays we think of metadata as being potentially just as identifiable and just as revealing, as kind of more sort of contentful data. So I'm not aware of kind of other typologies that are going to be helpful for articulating some of these kind of fine-grained distinctions to patients. The thing that I've found first and foremost is that you really are starting from a very low base when it comes to explaining the idea of being able to use any form of data to the general public. So if you're talking to people who haven't engaged with this before, even kind of distinctions around between data and metadata might be something that's quite difficult to get across, and that could well be something that we could do some more work to develop some further resources on. Examples are always really helpful, so rather than necessarily typologies of data sort of with the different categories, if you can give examples of the sorts of things you mean. So if you're talking about personal data, name, address, date of birth, postcode, things like that, people, oh, okay, I get that that's what that means. So rather than typologies, I suggest concrete examples, if they are accurate, are always the easiest way to start engaging people with these sorts of questions.
That's very helpful. And we have two other questions just as we're waiting for William to join us. Hopefully people can hear me okay. It seems to be that my microphone has packed up a little bit. So one question from Tina was, who's responsible for the ethical framework that we need to underpin any of the work that we're doing on data? And then tied into that, Ben's comment around, during your research, did you explore any attitudes of the general public to the downsides of not using the data, for example, fragmented care, which helps. Is that something you want to cover, or should we open that wider?
Yeah, I can cover that. So, responsible for the ethical framework, that is a really, really good question, because I think it's not at all clear. Government's very interested in data ethics. The Cabinet Office has a data ethics framework that it uses for data sharing between government departments. You've got the new Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation that was announced in the budget, which presumably at some point will form. You have the Nuffield Foundation, who are looking into developing a convention on data ethics, which might be a bit more of a kind of blue skies thinking, what's coming down the pipeline, how do we think about ethical issues there? So it's an area where no one was thinking about this a few years ago. Suddenly everyone is thinking about it, which in a sense is great, but it also means there's a lot of fragmentation and no authoritative guidance, for example, on, here's a framework you need to use to think about these sorts of questions. One of the challenges, of course, with thinking about ethics is that it doesn't provide neat, clear-cut answers. You can't say, right, we're going to plug in some ethical thinking into this AI now. It never has those sorts of prescriptive, here are the answers to your questions. All ethical sort of frameworks can do is encourage you to ask the right questions and potentially give you some tools to help frame how you think about them, but it can't give you answers. So I think the question of who's responsible is a really good one. I would argue that everyone who is working with or developing AI tools has a responsibility to think about some of the ethical questions. I anticipate that in the coming year, 18 months or so, there will be a proliferation of people offering sort of ethical frameworks and advice. But the key thing to remember is it's not something that you can outsource or bolt on. you have to do some of the hard work as well. So sorry if that's not much of an answer. I do think everyone has a responsibility, and I do anticipate there'll be some more frameworks coming, for example, from government, potentially from NHS Digital, but I'm not sure about that. In relation to, what was the other question? Let me just flick back through oh yeah, potential downsides of not using data. Yeah, this is something that we are really interested in because it helps the case. It's not just if we use data we can do X, it's if we don't use data, here are the downsides. And we do have a few examples on our website about cases where failure to share and use data has had catastrophic results. We didn't explore this in the Ipsos Mori research I mentioned specifically, partly just due to time constraints more than anything, but it's certainly a very powerful argument to make that failure to be able to make better use of data is going to be really, really problematic for delivering care and also for undertaking research. Definitely a good point. Someone mentioned GDPR as well. Yes, GDPR will reshape the landscape, I think, to some extent, partly because it will just make it'll force people who are using data and data controllers to be much, much clearer about what they're using, why they're using it, what their legal basis for processing data is. We're all going to have to get much better at articulating what personal data we're using and why and on what basis. And I think that's definitely a good thing. It'll be a bit of a pain for researchers, but I do think it's a positive thing in terms of giving people a better understanding of their rights and actually what's happening to their data in practice. Dominic, I'm aware there's a lot of questions on the chat. I don't know how best to manage them.
Let me just get William on here as well. 1 second. So I think there's a number of different interesting questions here. I think some of this could be passed back to those of us who are on here already, because I know some of you represent some of those organizations that might be on this. So and I know that some of those organizations are listening, might not be able to join this session, but might be listening. So do we want to kind of summarize some of those? John, are you able to see some of those questions and summarize some of them to identify the ones that are addressed either now or later on, around sharing some of the work that's currently happening in the system so that we all know what's going on?
Yeah, given time constraints, it seems sensible to sort of analyse the comments thread in more depth following this webinar and sort of share pertinent questions with the group via email. If William is around, it would be wonderful to hear from him for some of the last 15 minutes. If not, I personally would be very keen to invite John Sell to share some comments. It seems to be quite common for conversations to focus purely on health rather than social care, and John works for a local authority and is focused on social care and has agreed to share some thoughts. So if William is around, perhaps invite him in.
William's just struggling to connect at the moment because he's in a hospital trust. So let's pass over to John for now, and if we manage to have time for William, we will. But let's keep the conversation fluid. So shall I unmute John? Let me just go and find him in the list. John, I'm just going to unmute you now. Hopefully you can talk.
Can I talk?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear us.
Okay, I hope you can hear me too. It's a bit echoey from where I am. In social care, we've had the challenge for several years now of care navigation, information advice navigation. So we're really good at producing information advice and guidance, provided that the person knows exactly what they're looking for and can go ahead and find it. What works really well in social care is disruption. So people come looking for information. If they call one of our dedicated call centres, the social care advisors are very adept at navigating people through the options available. So the person nearly always ends up with something very different from what they thought they were coming for. Doing that online is incredibly difficult. So when we became aware of AI, and its potential sometime about 18 months ago, we could see that as a disruptive tool, it offers a great deal of potential to us. So we have a project going in Yorkshire and Humber at the moment, looking at the proof of concept for taking some typical queries that come into our contact centre, and then rather than giving the direct route to the information the person's looking for, we go on a little journey. And going through AI, we hope that the journey will be very similar to the journey that people go on talking to our social care advisors, so that the outcome is comparable, if not better, using AI. This is just a proof of concept at the moment on a 12-month time scale. So hopefully by this time next year, we'll know the extent to which we are able to fulfill that challenge of disrupting the journey that the person goes through and ends up with the information advice they need to make well-informed decisions, similar to if they had a discussion with a social care advisor. We find that incredibly exciting, having waited several years to get to this point.
Great, thank you very much, John. Any comments on the sort of relevance or perhaps problematic nature of so many materials being developed specifically in relation to health? For example, this very useful work that the Wellcome Trust and others have been doing about understanding patient data. Do you feel that that translates quite directly onto social care? John, I seem to have lost you. Am I still audible to?
I'm speaking. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I can hear you. Great.
Could you repeat the question, John, please?
So, is a language of patients in social care completely appropriate? I'm aware that public health and social care have different languages around, and I'm interested to know your thoughts on how fitting this understanding patient data framework that Natalie's just presented on, is that completely relevant and useful for social care colleagues? Should we be promoting that to our social care colleagues?
Yeah, we should, particularly with integration, because when you talk about patients, of course, in social care, we don't have patients, we have people, because what we strive to do is personalise the journey and the route. So at one level, all the language we use is everyday language, and anything that is jargonised is removed. And the ownership of the journey belongs very much to the person, and we help the person navigate their journey through social care. So that's a sort of philosophy that we follow, which is very different from health. So contrasting and doing the comparison with the journey of the patient journey through AI is very interesting. And of course, because as we move closer and closer to integration, we need to bridge that gap. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Thank you. That echoes my understanding that the language is problematic, but the concerns are very similar, and it seems the comments in the thread sort of also agree. In fact, there's been a suggestion that we might focus on language, perhaps in one of these sessions. Rather than talk too much myself, John, did you have any other comments or questions you'd like to share with the group, or perhaps should we hand back over to Dom?
No, I'm fine, but I'm available always to discuss this more widely. It's a passion of mine.
Yes, I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation. I don't think this is solved in one session. I'm going to attempt to try and unmute William. William, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant. The issues of working in a clinical setting. So everybody, I'd like to welcome William just for the last few minutes to talk about some of the work that he's doing and initiate a conversation. I know that we don't have enough time to go into all the detail, but William, can I hand over to you? I've got your slide up on the screen now, so
brilliant.
It'd be really good just to talk about some of the work you're doing, because I think it kind of grounds it into the reality of the frontline workforce who's trying to do some of this work.
Great. Tom, thanks very much for the invitation to talk. So I'm a consultant cardiologist at UHB in Birmingham, and I specifically look after a large cohort of patients with an inherited cardiac disease called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I'm not sure if the slide's showing, but the figure on the left-hand side is of a patient, a 14-year-old lad who died suddenly with the condition. And essentially it's characterized by extreme hypertrophy, there we see it now, of the heart, thickening of the heart wall, which unfortunately in a small number of people predisposes patients to the risk of sudden death. And one of the things over time that's been apparent, working particularly with this genetic disease in the West Midlands, is the problem of silos of data. So we've had a number of instances where I've been looking after one family member, and there's relevant information in a different family's medical record in another hospital that if only I had access to it would simplify and streamline the care of the patient in front of me. So I was particularly interested in developing a regional collaborative to help improve quality of care for these patients. And in September last year, we set up a West Midlands collaborative which features interested clinicians from each acute trust in the region, as well as Cardiomyopathy UK, which is the patient charity, the coroners, and also the ambulance service. So we had a really strong foundation on which to look at how we can use data more wisely and really exploit maximum value from data. And that sort of built towards this vision of a learning health system where data, however it had been acquired, could be exploited to its maximum value by putting it into a system where everybody in a permitted fashion could make use of it. And that's just shown in the figure under West Midlands HOCUM Learning Health System. So that's really our long-term aim, is to have a system where data flows freely in a permitted fashion. And one area we're particularly naturally interested in using that data is to try and improve on the prediction scores we use to identify which individuals are at higher risk of sudden death and which individuals, therefore, should be recommended this pacemaker device called a defibrillator, which can prevent sudden death. And that's really been the holy grail for researchers for a number of years. And the small figure just below the learning health system that I've shown is the risk calculator that's been in use and recommended by the European Society of Cardiology for the last 3 years. And the thing I just want to draw your attention to is that there are only 7 parameters that are used to define the risk of sudden death. Thanks. And I think I was always struck by the notion that big data may have a better answer, particularly coming off the back of the work from Cambridge Analytica in their efforts around the presidential campaign last year, where up to 5,000 data points were being used. So in that regard, we've got a really rich data set, which I've just shown with that schematic in the bottom left-hand corner. It doesn't show terribly well, but what it just relays is there's a rich wealth of information related to these patients. So there's genetic data, there's family history data, there's the heart tracing, the heart scan, be it with echocardiography or MRI, the exercise test results, their tape monitoring results, but most importantly, their clinical letters, which since I've been in practice here over the last 5 years, I've used a very standard template in order to capture relevant information for these patients. But what was clear was that's a large number of items, and in fact that those are 7 different systems from which that information's pulled. But we didn't, up to 2 years ago, have a single place where we could store all that information until we developed a dedicated SQL registry, which is just on the right-hand side, and which has been in use for the last 2 years to capture data on consecutive patients with this condition. And for me, that was an exciting step forward because it meant that we, for the first time, had a single place where all relevant information for these patients was held and could be updated whenever, for example, a new event occurred or when a new clinical form of contact arose. But we came to recognize that that really wasn't going to be enough. And what has been the turning point has been this adoption of an embedded academic model by the University's Hospital Birmingham in conjunction with the University of Birmingham. So that came with the appointment of one of my colleagues who's a prof of bioinformatics, George Kahoutos, who also brought with him a team of computer scientists. And that for us has been the major shift forward, and I think provides the framework by which we hope to be able to achieve this machine learning approach to prediction of sudden death. So the really key step forward for us has been the development of a natural language programming workflow that allows us to extract data from unstructured data sets such as clinic letters, MRI, echo reports, and not only allows us to address extraction of data from my own letters, which is time-consuming and cumbersome, particularly when we're doing it retrospectively, but also allows us to gain an insight into patients diagnosed with a condition who I've never met. So we're actively exploring at this present time, looking at those defined patients who I've never met across the electronic patient record, both in this hospital, but also across the West Midlands. I should add that NHS England have supported this work by funding the development of the registry so it can go into each hospital. But the natural language processing work that's been developed in parallel is absolutely fundamental, because just the volume of work means, from a manual perspective, there would be too much for any single team to manage to extract their own data. And what that brings us to is the figure on the top right, which is taken from the recent FDA guidance on software as a medical device, and shows the fact that you need an input in terms of the patient data. You then need an algorithm and an output, and that output could take many different forms. It may just be clinical decision support tool, it might be a diagnostic tool or a management tool. In this case, it would be a risk prediction tool for sudden death. And we're very cognizant of the concern over the sort of black box algorithm that's unknowable, and how clinicians might work with that in the future. So as much as possible, our machine learning will be developed with the notion that it should be unpickable, or at least be understandable from a clinician's perspective, so that in the future patients can understand the rationale by which a decision has been made. But as you can see from that figure, we're literally at the very beginning of that journey, and it sort of reminds me of a New York Times article last year where it drew attention to the fact that the majority of the work that goes into machine learning is data wrangling, data cleaning, data cleansing at the very beginning. And whereas we'd all like to be at the sort of bright, shiny end where you can actually see the results, this foundational work has to go in first. It has thrown up some interesting information governance and ethical challenges. Whilst I was dealing with data related to patients that I knew and looked after and therefore had a legitimate relationship with, there was less of an issue. But as soon as one starts to look at identifiable patient data with whom I have no legitimate relationship, we recognized that we needed to pursue a Section 251, and we're in that process at the moment. And it's for obvious reasons the data needs to be identifiable, because we need to follow it through to endpoints, but not only that, then trace back which of the patients in the West Midlands cohort in the future are at higher risk. So necessarily there's that work that's needing to go in around Section 251. We'll also be needing to put in applications for research projects to develop new technologies, both for the natural language processing and also the machine learning risk prediction tool. The ultimate aim, and I'm hopeful that it will be towards the end of this year, is that we're then in a position to be able to produce a novel risk algorithm that outperforms existing risk algorithms, and then use those patients within the West Midlands that we haven't extracted data on to validate it, and hopefully through that process change practice. So I'm sorry to join you so late, and it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I hope Dom gives a picture of what we're trying to achieve here in Birmingham and the West Midlands.
Yeah, no, this is really helpful, William, and I appreciate your time, and I know that you know, juggling clinical is difficult. I think there's a lot of people here that would be interested in you know, understanding the process you're going through, and I know that Ben has made some comments that I'm sure you'll resonate with. Has anybody got any questions for William? William, do you have any questions for the community that where you're at in terms of this project, where you feel you need support, or what you would like to happen next? And just to tack onto that, I know that the time has just gone over 2 o'clock, so if you do need to leave, feel free to leave. The session is being recorded, so we can share it on YouTube in the next day or so. But if you can hang on for another minute or two, it'd be great to just finish up on this piece of conversation.
So I think, Dom, we've spoken about this before. The bit I just wanted to make sure and to reach out to others about is whether anybody has, if you like, cracked consent for learning health systems in general, but learning health systems that employ a machine learning component to them. Because in discussion with, in fact, I've spoken to to Damefield, the National Office of the Data Guardian, who are encouraging in this work, but there doesn't seem to be any easy answers around both the Section 251 and the consent issues. And I think what strikes me is how difficult it will be in terms of a package to patients. We will be consenting them potentially for multiple different issues, not least the fact if we're planning on using a machine learning approach in their treatment in the future, they're going to need to have consented to that as per the GDPR in order to allow care to be driven in part by an algorithm. So if anybody has any thoughts or there's any precedents about people who've done similar work around learning health systems with machine learning embedded in them, that I'd be very grateful for any thoughts.
You've got an immediate one there from Ben. Ben, do you want to say anything on the line, or you want to just keep it in the chat? And William, can I put your email address into the conversation thread, if that's okay?
So Ben, has Ben put a question there?
Ben's saying that he's happy to discuss if you like.
Fantastic.
And I'm sure he'll pick up that with you directly. I'll put your email address in the chat box.
Fantastic.
Does anybody have anything else to say or add to this conversation? I know there's a number of people are messaging throughout before we draw this to a close. Just give it a second.
Dom, I just wanted to say on the consent issue, under GDPR, it's fairly likely that the research that you're doing, although consent is going to be important for fairness and transparency and for ethical reasons, it might not actually be your legal basis for processing data. And it's worth checking out the new HRA guidance on GDPR, which is quite clear that for a lot of research, the legal basis on which you'll be processing data is likely to be something like public interest in the first instance, and not consent, given that the requirements for GDPR compliant consent are incredibly high. Very happy to sort of follow up with you and talk more about that if that would be helpful.
Definitely, thank you.
Yeah, and it'd be really good to share what you guys discussed back with other people that are a bit more shy. So, look, I want to thank both Natalie and William and those of you who have joined us today for this conversation. We have gone over time a little bit, and apologies about that, but I think it was really important that we listen to the work that William's doing as well. We'll be coming back on the 7th of February. We've got a couple of people interested in speaking on that session, but I wanted to kind of keep it open. So if there's anything that you feel out of this session that needs to go into more detail, or you'd like to continue this piece of the conversation, please let us know so that we can make sure that the conversation is relevant. And just starting back at the conversation around terms of reference, with working with some of our friends in the vendor community who have some solutions to some of the health problems technologically, we can bring those in and show them, get them the opportunity to show what's currently happening. And I'd love your support on that. Thank you very much, everybody. I'd like to draw it to a close now, and I wish you all the rest of a happy Wednesday and the rest of your week, and as I didn't say at the start, Happy New Year, and we shall speak in a month's time. Thank you very much, everybody, and speak soon.